So let me go ahead and introduce the project to you. So what is our focus over the winter months that are approaching? As you know, we purchased this car back in 2020 as a COVID project, and that has really taken off and spurred a number of videos and has led us to future projects. Well, now it's time to go back and place some attention on this car because it is less than perfect, and that kind of bugs me. This is a car that I enjoy driving. I know I don't do a lot of driving videos. My channel is more focused on the performance and also the maintenance of these cars, more as an educational tool. Every once in a while I sprinkle in some driving content, but for the most part I want to focus on education because there's a lot of bad information out there. So if you come here for Acura CL content and you're interested in learning how to do a clutch replacement or suspension removal part replacement, etc., you're going to want to stay tuned to this series. Well, as we went through the Acura CL and replaced a number of things, there were some things that I just overlooked because, one, they weren't to the point where I felt like they needed to be replaced, and spending the money on this car had already reached a pretty high premium. Well, some of these things I want to go back and take a look at, or I want to go back and actually remedy. So things like, the rusting that's occurring on some of the nuts and bolts is pretty minor, but we're going to focus on that. We're also going to focus on things like these brake lines down here. And we're going to show you how to make your own brake lines. We're going to show you how to replace these brake lines. And we're going to focus on, like I said, the clutch. Well, one of the things that I would have loved to have done was put a lightened flywheel in here, but there's not a consensus view about what clutch matches up with the flywheel when you switch from a dual mass to, say, a billet flywheel. It's well documented that you can go with a lightened flywheel, say from ASCO, but there is not a consensus view about what clutch matches up with that because the OEM clutch is unsprung because of the dual mass flywheel. The aftermarket clutches that are sprung don't often pair up well with a billet one and give you that OEM clutch feel. And I rather have an OEM clutch feel than add some high revving RPM to our engine. While it would have been nice, I rather focus on OEM. That's not the focus necessarily of this. If you choose to go with a billet flywheel and you want to put in an aftermarket clutch, that's great. We'll teach you how to remove the transmission. We'll show you all the seals that you should be removing and replacing while you're in there. And we'll detail out all the subsequent information related to getting in there and doing this job. Okay, so let's go over the parts list that you will need for replacing your clutch in your vehicle. So this will apply to the Acura CL Type-S only. Some of these parts may cross over to the automatic version, but specifically, as you know, we're talking about the Type-S 6-speed. So you can go OEM or you can cross-reference parts, which is what I do. I know what the OEM supplier is for most parts, so I go to the OEM supplier and buy my parts directly from them instead of through Honda in some cases, just because there's a huge savings there. So keep that in mind when I talk about some of these items. But whenever it comes to seals, I try to get the OEM ones as much as possible. I find that aftermarket ones either don't work after initial install or for whatever reason they have a short life. So let's go over the parts that you will need in bare minimum. There's extra parts here on the table that I can talk about, but for the most part, let's talk about what you absolutely should do if you're going to replace the clutch at a bare minimum. So obviously you should get a clutch and you should get a flywheel. I'll just leave that up to you however you want to piece together your flywheel and clutch assembly. So you can go OEM with Luke, and that's an OEM dual mass Luke flywheel from them directly. And then we have a clutch right here that would pair up with that flywheel, all OEM. You can do that if you want. And other people like to do lightened flywheel, or they like to do a sprung clutch with a lightened flywheel because it revs a little bit faster. I decided not to do that and keep it OEM. So here is your throwout bearing, and there's your part number right there. So this is the bearing that goes on the transmission um, spline and pushes against the springs on your clutch pack so that it disengages it. So that's one part that you will absolutely need. You should replace it, and I would recommend going with this brand right here, which is the OEM supplier. You should also get a new pilot bearing. Your pilot bearing is what goes into your flywheel and is what is a major component in how it spins. So it goes into the center of that. And it does come with an NSK one, but I'm using this brand because it's a high quality Japanese brand. So there's your part number for that. That's the one thing I would say is the OEM setup doesn't use this bearing. They use the NSK one. The problem with NSK is that sometimes they're made in Japan, sometimes they're made in China. This is made in Japan. This is known as a high quality bearing, so I'm going and replacing that NSK one with this. Okay, so trans seals. These are the seals that go where the half shaft on one side goes, and then on the other side, it's the actual axle that goes into there. You should replace those because while you're in there, these are super easy to replace and they often are a source of leaks. So go ahead and replace those. It doesn't take long, and then you'll have nice new seals anyways. And they're really inexpensive. So there's your part number for both sides. This seal right here is also a trans oil seal. Don't worry about that. That's something else that you can do. Okay, this is the part that fails the most on the rear main seal. And when we go to install this, I'll show you this in better detail, but that's the part number in the O-ring. And this O-ring is at the top of the metal plate. When you take the metal plate off the side of the engine, you'll have the rear main seal, and then above it is a little O-ring. This is that little O-ring, so that should absolutely be replaced because that is the common source of rear main seal leaks, not the sole source, but the most common. And then this is the part number for your rear main seal. And you should absolutely replace this. There's no reason why you shouldn't. It's it's kind of foolish not to because you're in there. The other thing that you will need is super high temp urea grease from Honda. There are a number of parts that need to be lubricated with that, but mainly you want to lubricate the inside of your bearing races for this, and then there's the tabs that push out. Those should get lubricated as well. We'll go into more detail with that. You also want to use blue semi-permanent um, lock thread or thread locker or whatever brand you want to use. This is just Harbor Freight. It's not going to make that big of a difference. The whole point of it is that when you put your flywheel on, those bolts need to be locked in with blue Loctite. So make sure you have that. The other thing that I'm doing is this is the boot for the fork that pushes up against the throwout bearing. Mine was ripped, so I'm replacing that. If you want to know the part number, there's your part number. And then these are extra trans seals that I went ahead and purchased. Most of these likely don't need to be replaced, but I went ahead and just purchased them anyways. That way, if I'm in there and I notice that they should be replaced, then they will get replaced. So that's the part list so far for what you're absolutely going to need. There's obviously more parts that you can go into. You can do all sorts of while you're in there tasks, but for right now, that's just the main components. I also forgot to mention that you will need manual transmission fluid. I only use Honda, but I know other people use like GM Synchro Mesh. Typically, those are um, transmission fluids that have an additive to them to prevent grinding. So if you're not having any issues with your transmission, sticking with genuine Honda or Acura manual transmission fluid will probably be the best for you. You'll need about 3 quarts. Owner's manual says that if you're going to drain the fluid out completely, like I did for this project, you're going to need 2.5. But if you're only going to do basically a drain and removal of the transmission, I think it's 2.2. But just go ahead and have 3 on hand anyways, I would say. You gotta buy 3 to get to that volume. I always keep a couple on hand just in case. And one last part, can't forget the Honda Bond. Honda Bond is not super critical for this project. You could use a different gasket maker, but Honda Bond is probably the go-to for all Honda and Acura products, and even people outside of that will use Honda Bond for a lot of their applications. So pick yourself up a tube of this and keep it on hand. It's kind of crucial to a lot of the products that, or a lot of the projects that I do, so never hurts to have this on hand. You're going to need this for when you do the rear main seal. This is going to be used to seal up around it, and we'll show you that when we get to it, but just have a tube of this kicking around for that. And then, another quick thing I want to show everybody is, if you're not aware of this, here's the factory mount for when you're working on, or when the car is in normal position for the hood, but you can put it right here, and this will give your hood that service mode, so it's holding up. And I just threw the other one in there. It's not screwing, it doesn't screw in, it just kind of rests in there just as a safety measure in case this shock starts to give out. It shouldn't, because it's newer, but just kind of an FYI there. All right, so I wanted to show you real quick where we're at in the process, just so you kind of understand what we've done so far and where we're heading. So real quick, I want to reference that you do need an engine support bar in some way, and I'll show you that later in the video, but basically you want to support the engine as you're removing the support structure from it so that the engine doesn't drop and you end up damaging something. So real quick. So what we've done real quick is, or what we've done so far, I should say, is disconnect the battery. We removed the bolt that's securing the support structure and relocated it to its service position. Moved the air induct intake, and then we removed the engine cover. We removed the battery, and we removed the battery tray. As you can see here, we're moving down. We've got the harness out of the way, relocated right now, and then we've got the engine damper removed. So that's right there. We're working on disconnecting the sensors, or we've done that too, I should say. All that's out of the way. And then remove and disconnect the starter. So right here you can see that there's an engine harness that goes right into that. That's to give you power. There's also a little connector right there. It's like a stud connector, and then another connector on the backside, which I think is the ground for the starter. Then you've got these two bolts, which we've talked about earlier. You want to remove those to get the starter out of the way. It's pretty easy if you can do that. So that's right there. And then we removed the harness and the ground cable, just kind of relocated it out of the way. And then we've gone ahead and disconnected this sensor, but we haven't removed it. It actually calls for you to remove the crank position sensor on this, so that's interesting. We'll go ahead and do that, just probably more so to make sure you don't damage it on the way out when you're lowering the transmission. And then we went ahead and removed our hybrid racing shifter bearings and the corresponding cables and the bracket that goes for that. So the bracket goes down in, just connected with 3 bolts, really simple. And then we removed the slave cylinder for the clutch. You don't want to disconnect this unless you want to bleed the system as well. You could go ahead and disconnect the connection fitting right there and then just rebleed the system if you wanted to, but you don't have to. I showed you how the boot right here connects to the slave cylinder, and that boot was ripped, and I think that might have been part of our contributing issues with the clutch. I think moisture got in there, so that's probably one way it got in. And then we're working on removing the 2 upper transmission mounting bolts. That'll be next. And you can see here's the engine support beam that we're going to have to put in place soon. So that's what we're going to do next. We're going to go ahead and connect those. I'll show you where that connects so that you're doing it safely and it takes the guesswork out of that. And then we'll raise the car up and start working underneath. But so fairly simple up top work, transitioning to the bottom here. This really positions us well to be able to see everything, be able to start our, like, kind of, once you jack the car up, it's a little harder to get to these things just from a height perspective. So just keep that in mind. Maybe it's a little bit easier for you if you're a taller person, but I like to have a fair amount of space underneath to work. And so we're going to do everything up top as the book suggests and then work underneath. Okay, so I wanted to give you an update on where we are. I got the support beam in place. I found that if you use one of these bolts that go right here and thread it into here, which is a recommended support area, and then put your support beam there, it kind of works. I would like to have a back one, but just because of the way that this is a single beam and at the dealership they use a T-beam, it's not going to work out quite right. So what I'll likely do is, while I'm removing the transmission, just put a jack under there to help support from the bottom. It's just additive. Probably doesn't need it, but I don't like the idea of just one bolt holding it up over there. And until we move the subframe out, it's probably not that even big of a concern. And this is just basically, you know, precautionary for the most part. You could probably take the transmission out without even this in place, but this is kind of how I've rigged it up for right now. As you can see, just kind of going like that and then right in the middle. So we'll go ahead now and jack up the car and then start working on the bottom panel removals. Okay, so let's talk about what we discovered real quick after we removed the bottom shield here. Um, so what we discovered is we've definitely got some sort of leak going on, likely a rear main seal starting to leak, or the corresponding gasket that's up above it, which we'll show later. You can see here that there's definitely some seepage going on, nothing probably too concerning. But we're going to go ahead and start to obviously get into this, and we'll start to remove some of, like, this right here. Oh, that's even loose. That's loose. That shouldn't be like that. So that's interesting. We'll go ahead and remedy that, obviously, as we remove this. But you can see that there's a little bit of surface rust going on right here. We're going to take care of all of that too. We're going to make sure that this subframe is going to last the length of the car. So that's very interesting that this is like this. This might be the source of our knocking noise that we started hearing. So interesting. Something has either loosened up, given up, or maybe we didn't tighten this down all the way when we did our work a couple years ago. let's do a quick recap, just kind of putting some voice to what we're doing here. So we removed the front spindle, the brakes, the axles, and the traction bar there. And where we're at right now is we've got everything prepped really to start removing this side of the subframe. So there's one bolt at the bottom of this, and there's one bolt at the bottom of this, and that really allows you to separate the subframe, so you can drop the subframe separate from this transmission mount beam here. And uh, what you want to do if you're just dropping the subframe, you just want to unbolt these three. Don't mess with these bolts. I actually cross-threaded this one in our original work that we did with the car. But really we're getting to the point where we're starting to prep this side. We're going to need to transition to the other side. And you don't need to go to this length to get the transmission out. I removed a little bit more to give myself some room to work. And really what you need to do is just pop out the transmission or the axle here so that it's not connected anymore to the spindle. Take this bar, the traction bar that goes across here, out with the two bolts that go to the lower control arm. You need to remove this bolt so that you can drop it out, and technically you could just take the spindle and drop it to the side if you wanted to. I took it out just to give myself more room, like I said. And then you really just need to remove the three bolts right there if you want to drop the mount with the subframe. I'm going to drop the subframe and the mounts together here, but I wanted to disconnect it from the bottom just because they're usually a little hard to get disconnected. So that's this side. We'll get the other side is basically the same, so we won't show you that. It's just basically more of the same of trying to get it. This is the more complicated side because it's connected to the transmission itself. When we get to the other axle, I'll probably show you how to remove the intermediate shaft, because that's a part that you have to do as well, is pop that intermediate shaft out. So we'll talk about that when we get to that side, but let me go ahead and get the other side prepped and ready to drop the front beam of the subframe out. And that's going to be, right here. This is like a split. So your rear beam and then your front beam is right here for the whole front cradle. Okay, so we've got everything disconnected on the passenger side as well. Basically, it's the same job. The only difference is you're removing the drive shaft from that hole right there, which is the intermediate shaft. You use a pry bar just to pop it out, and then we've got to come underneath and remove the intermediate shaft. So there's a couple bolts that hold it on. There's three, and then you pop it out the same way. And what we're going to do is get the intermediate shaft out here. Here's probably a better angle. So you can see right here, here's the intermediate shaft. Here's the bolts, and there's one on the other side. You want to remove those bolts. This is what anchors the intermediate shaft to the engine, allowing you to remove it so that you can remove the transmission. So we're going to do that real quick.
Is it a technology statement? Is it they just don't want you to do the manual gearboxes? Has someone got a rod version? I don't know what it is. Yeah. Look how watch this trying to get away. Cost is nothing. They're doing one gearbox is associated. What are we doing? If Porsche wasn't having success with it, I would say, okay, well, there's no more. But because if you just follow Porsche, it's like obviously what you say. I had the Ferrari prices. What's the prices of today, you couldn't sell them when you couldn't, could you? You can't, really wasn't. They got a manual California,
Okay, so we're back. We've got the intermediate shaft out. Pretty easy. You remove those three bolts that go right there. As you can see, a little triangle. There's one on top, and I would recommend using a shallow ratchet socket for those two just to get in there. And then that third one over on the left there, I used a ratcheting wrench to get in there. It's a little tight to get in there with a ratchet. So now we're going to remove the front subframe. We've got a couple bolts here that hold it on. And then we've got this one right here. And once we remove it, it'll just drop right down. So you may want to support it Make sure that you've got something underneath it, like maybe a jack, or maybe somebody can help you just, you know, basically lower that without it crashing down. We've got some surface rust right there, no big deal, we'll take care of that. We'll just paint it up with some paint over rust. And then this is basically getting ready for the transmission to come out. So it's really close. It only took probably about 2 hours to get to this point. Struggled with some suspension parts, but we got that squared away. So I'll pick back up when we're ready to remove the transmission. Okay, so we've got the subframe removed. We've got the transmission here. We've got it propped up with just a jack here. I'll probably put something underneath this side too for right now. And then you can see how much room that we have. Once we get this bar out of the way for the transmission, we should be able to easily remove this by just removing the bolts that hold the transmission to the engine here. So when I say transmission to the engine, I'm talking about these bolts right here. They go all the way around the bell housing. There's not a lot of them, so really we're on the home stretch already. Just to give you an idea, this took me probably about 2.5 hours to get to this point. We got to drain the transmission fluid out. That will lighten our load, so don't forget to do that. And yeah, real close to getting the transmission out here. Pretty easy, I would say, all in all. This is probably one of the easier transmission clutch jobs I've done in history. It's really not that difficult to do, so this is what you're looking at. I have a feeling that once we get into the transmission and we need to remove the rear main seal bracket, I think we're going to have to drop the oil pan, but we're going to leave all of that alone for right now. I'm debating whether I want to get a transmission jack underneath this and lower it out in a better way, and then just kind of dropping it into my lap and trying to wrestle it. It looks bigger than I thought, so we will be safe before we be hasty. All right, so I forgot to mention you have to remove this engine mount bracket right here because it kind of keeps everything together. You can see this is where the dividing line is right in here, and if we kept that in there, it would be difficult to remove, near impossible. So we're ready to go. We're ready to remove the transmission. We've got plenty of room around on the front. However, we don't have a lot of room in the back. Looking at the back of it, it looks like it's pretty tight up against there. So it'll be interesting to see how that comes out. This may be one of those situations where you want to rent the tool, get yourself a support jack for the transmission, or at least give you something like maybe some built up wood around there just to support the transmission while you're trying to back it off. Other than that, we'll stop the video right here and we'll pick up on the next video when we remove the transmission.